Good afternoon. I am Radhika Prasad, a PhD student in the Quantum Optics and Entanglement Lab at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur. So, today I will be talking about our recent work on generating structured spatial correlations of entangled photons. To begin with, let us look at what actually motivated us to get interested in this work and why this particular work could actually be interesting. So classically, structured spatial correlations leads to enhanced resolution in imaging, meaning it leads to better sub-Rayleigh limit of the resolution. And using position correlated entangled photons in applications like quantum imaging offers better signal to noise ratio and noise robustness. So we would like to explore if we can bring in the added benefits provided by structure into the quantum regime for applications which make use of spatial entanglement. Keeping this in mind, let us look at how we actually generate these entangled photons having structured spatial correlations. So, just as the speaker before me mentioned, spontaneous parametric down conversion, or SPDC in short, is a process used to generate entangled photons in which we have a nonlinear crystal and a pump beam is incident on it. The pump photon gets destroyed, giving rise to two new down converted photons called the signal and idler. Now, these photons are entangled in various degrees of freedom, for example, position momentum, time frequency, angle orbital angular momentum, as well as polarization. We would be focusing on the position momentum degree of freedom over here. Energy and momentum are conserved in this process. However, if the wave vectors do not match up perfectly, then we have delta kz mismatch, which decreases the efficiency of the process. The pump propagation direction and crystal's optic axis make an angle theta b between them, which is known as the phase matching angle. And delta kz over here, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but delta kz is essentially a function of theta p. The nomenclature of phase matching is that if both the down converted photons move in the same direction, we call it collinear phase matching. Whereas if both the down converted photons move in different directions, we call it non-collinear phase matching condition. So as theta p increases, we slowly move from collinear phase matching to non-collinear phase matching conditions. Let us now look at how to mathematically represent the two photon state. So this is how we write it in the transverse momentum basis. Over here, we see this V, which is the pump field amplitude, and this quantity phi is the phase matching function. The pump field amplitude is taken to be having a Gaussian profile for our experiment, and phi, the phase matching function, is essentially a sinc function of delta kz, which in turn is a function of theta p. Let us now look at what we mean by correlations and how do we structure the correlations. So in this regard, there are two quantities which are important. First, we have the coincidence count, which is basically the probability of detecting the signal photon at location Rs and the idler photon at location Ri simultaneously or in coincidence. This is how the distribution looks like when we are very close to the crystal. We see the presence of strong correlations in the form of this diagonal. The other quantity is the conditional detection probability. This is the probability of detecting the idler photon at location Ri naught, given that the signal photon has, detecting the signal photon at location Rs, given that the idler photon has already been detected at location Ri naught. So this is the conditional probability distribution, and this is how it looks like when we are close to the crystal. If we look at the 1D cuts, we see that both these quantities carry essentially the same information, and they are just slightly different ways of looking at correlations. So now that we know what correlations are, we will see how we can actually structure these correlations. So let us focus on the conditional detection probability. What do we mean by structuring these correlations? So structuring the correlations means trying to get different distributions, different kinds of shapes for this distribution of conditional probability. So once again, let us look at the schematic of SPDC that we have. When we are looking close to the crystal, when we are looking at the distribution close to the crystal, we call it the near field distribution. And when we are looking at the distribution far away from the crystal, it is called far field regime. When we manipulate the pump field profile, then the effect of that shows up in the far field. Whereas if we manipulate the phase matching conditions or the properties of the crystal, then the effect shows up in the near field. So if we have a structured pump field profile, then this shows up in the far field conditional probability distribution. Coming to the near field, let us start with a Gaussian pump field profile. So this is how the conditional distribution looks like when we are close to the crystal. Now, if we tilt the crystal slightly, then we change the phase matching conditions of the crystal, then this is how the near field conditional distribution looks like. We see that the blob becomes a ring. So tilting the crystal essentially changes the angle theta p between the crystal's optic axis and the pump propagation direction. Now, are these the only kind of structures that are possible? Well, turns out that if we add another crystal in our setup, then down conversion can take place either in the first crystal or in the second crystal. In this situation, we see rich fringe-like structures that are visible to us. Now, these structures can be controlled by the spacing between the crystals. So if we increase the spacing, we see that more number of these fringe-like structures appear. We would be focusing on this near field structuring, the reason being that if we look at the lower bound on the entanglement of formation, then it is positive in the case of near field, and it is negative for the case of far field. And entanglement of formation is used as an entanglement witness for us, meaning that if it is positive, then entanglement is present, and if it is negative, it is absent. In our experiment, we found that the lower bound on the entanglement of formation turned out to be close to 1, which means that entanglement was present in the near field. It is important to note that structuring appears only in the 2-photon correlations. The single photon intensity as viewed on the camera remains a blob, irrespective of the phase matching conditions. Let us now look at how we have experimentally detected these structured correlations. So a conventional technique for coincidence involves using 2 detectors and scanning, which is pretty much cumbersome and impossible to reconstruct a 2-dimensional structure. Our experimental technique involved using a single EMCCD camera, and for the position basis distribution, we would use 2 lenses, for momentum basis, a single lens. So these are the experimental results, the theory and the experimental results that we have. So first, this is the collinear phase matching. As we increase theta p, as we move slowly from collinear to non-collinear, we see that this diagonal splits up into 2 diagonals. So this is when we look at the coincidence count rate, and these non-collinear regime structures are the new kind of structures that we have witnessed. Similarly, as we mentioned earlier, instead of the coincidence count rate, if we look at the conditional probability distribution, then these are the results for that. Again, in the collinear regime, we have a blob, but as we move to non-collinear regime by increasing theta p slowly, we see that this blob becomes a ring. Again, these ring-like structures are new structures which we observed in our experiment, and we see that there is good match between our theory and the experiment. So this is for the double crystal setup. Again, over here, we see that as we increase the spacing, we see more number of these fringe-like structures appearing. In order to verify the presence of entanglement, we have made use of entanglement witnesses like EPR correlation width and the lower bound on entanglement of formation. For the non-collinear regime, the lower bound of entanglement of formation would be used because it is not possible to find out the width of fringe-like structures. So just for one simple case, I would present the results. So when the EPR correlation width is less than half, and when the lower bound on the entanglement of formation is positive, then we see that entanglement is present. To conclude, we have experimentally demonstrated and generated the structured two-photon correlations for entangled photons, and these structures have been generated by two methods. First, by tilting the crystal, and second, by adding another crystal, both of which essentially change the phase matching conditions. Finally, I would like to thank all the funding agencies for facilitating this experiment. Thank you. Yeah, very good. So if I go back uh, to, let's say, this two crystal thing. So as you can see, that the third one, if you look at it, D equal to 6 millimeters, you see that the contrast and visibility is somewhat poor. This is because the coherence length that we used for our pump beam was of the order of 5 millimeters. So when it is 2 mm, when the separation between the crystals is 2 mm, 4 mm, it is very good. The contrast and visibility is very good. But as we exceed the coherence length of the laser that we use, we see that the contrast starts to fall down. Okay, so if we use this quantity for a witness, so in the spatial entanglement degree of freedom, in the position momentum degree of freedom, this is what we observe, that if you look at either EPR correlation width, or if you look at the entanglement of formation as a witness, then this is the kind of feature that you observe, that when you are close to the crystal, you witness it in the form of that EPR correlation width, and when you move away from the crystal, you see that the EPR correlation width does not exactly violate. So yeah, this is the feature of position momentum entanglement. Mhm. Mm. So, as I mentioned, so this is only for the position momentum degree of freedom. I'm not saying for polarization degree of freedom. Only in the position momentum degree of freedom, only when we look at witnesses like EPR correlation width or the entanglement of formation, this is what you observe. Maybe we could talk afterwards more on this. I think this is quite a common interest. Like many people are having this question.